No one would have her, said Mrs. Crowe, and laughed, a dry, satisfied, cackling laugh that Esther Vale had heard so many times in 7 years that she scarcely flinched at it any longer. No one, my dear Mrs. Paget, and so I tell her, for it is no kindness to let a girl dream above her prospects. Look at her. 25, not a penny to her name, and a face that was never anything to speak of, and is less now. What gentleman, I ask you, would saddle himself with that? No, she is fixed here with me, and may think herself fortunate that I keep her, for the world has no other use for a portionless plain old maid, and never will. Esther, the tea is cold. Are you good for nothing at all? Esther rose from the corner where she had been mending her aunt's lace, the corner being where she was generally to be found, mending, or fetching, or being scolded, and went to see to the tea, with the quiet, composed face she had perfected over 7 years of such afternoons. And Mrs. Paget, the visitor, watched her go with the faint, embarrassed pity that the comfortable feel for the dependent, and murmured something about the girl seeming a very useful sort of creature, which was the kindest thing anyone had said of Esther Vale in that drawing-room in living memory. For this was the settled order of the household and of Esther's whole reduced existence. That she was the poor relation, the orphaned niece taken in out of charity, the unpaid drudge who ran the house and waited on her aunt and her cousin, and was reminded daily by every word and look that she was a burden suffered rather than a person valued, plain and portionless and unwanted, with no future before her, but to wait on Mrs. Crowe until one or the other of them died. She had heard no one would have her so often that it had worn a groove in her. She did not quite believe it in the deep private place where she kept her own counsel, for her father had taught her better. But she had stopped expecting the world to believe anything else, and had folded away, years since, any girlish hope of a life of her own as a thing not meant for such as her. She brought the fresh tea, and was found fault with for the delay, and retired again to her corner and her mending, and Mrs. Crowe resumed her cackling catalogue of her niece's deficiencies for Mrs. Paget's benefit, secure in the knowledge, confirmed by 7 years and the whole plain evidence of the world, that no one would ever have Esther Vale, that the girl was fixed and finished and safely worthless, and that the matter was as settled as anything on earth could be. She was wrong. She was, at that very hour, more completely and more spectacularly wrong than she had ever been about anything in the whole course of her self-satisfied life. For at that very hour, not 3 miles distant, in the library of a great house she had been angling to enter for a 12-month, the Duke of Glanville sat at his writing table, with the deed of a marriage settlement spread before him and a pen in his hand, and was writing, in his own firm hand, in the space left for the name of his intended Duchess, the name of Esther Vale. The cruel symmetry of that opening hour, the aunt cackling her verdict in one house, while the Duke wrote his answer to it in another, is worth lingering on, for the 2 scenes, unfolding at the same moment, 3 miles apart, and in perfect ignorance of each other, contained between them the whole meaning of the story. In the one house sat Mrs. Crowe, complacent in her drawing-room, delivering to a visitor her settled judgment upon her niece with the relish of a woman entirely sure of herself, that the girl was plain, portionless, 25, finished, fixed, unwanted, that no one would ever have her, that the matter was beyond all question. It was a verdict she had pronounced 1,000 times, and it had hardened, through repetition and through 7 years of apparent confirmation, into something she held as solid fact, as certain as the floor beneath her feet, the central comfortable certainty of her economical little world. on which her whole arrangement of a free perpetual servant rested. She uttered it that afternoon, as she had uttered it countless times, and laughed her dry cackling laugh, and never dreamed, never could have dreamed, that the ground of her certainty was at that very moment dissolving beneath her. For in the other house, 3 miles off, in a quiet library, sat the Duke of Glanville with the deed before him, writing into it, slowly and with reverence, the very name his neighbor was, at that hour declaring no one would take. The two scenes could not have been more opposite, nor more exactly matched. The aunt loud and certain and wrong, the Duke silent and humble and right. The one pronouncing the girl worthless to a half-attending visitor, the other inscribing her worth in his own hand upon the instrument that would proclaim it to all England. And the deep irony that joined them across those 3 miles was the very engine of the tale, that the world's confident verdict and the truth about a person can run thus side by side, in total contradiction and total ignorance of each other, the loud certainty entirely false and the quiet truth entirely unsuspected. And that Mrs. Crowe, cackling her sureness that no one would have her niece, was at that instant being refuted, completely and forever, by a hand she could not see, in a room she had spent a year trying in vain to enter. She thought she knew exactly what Esther Vale was worth. She was 3 miles and a whole world away from the truth, and the truth was being written down, in that very hour, in a firm, reverent ducal hand, for all the future to read, to understand how the name the whole county believed unwanted came to be written by a duke's own hand upon a marriage deed. You must go back and learn who Esther Vale was beneath the apron and the scorn, and how she came to be a drudge in her aunt's house at all. She had not always been poor, nor always despised. She was the only child of a gentleman of modest fortune and his gentle wife, and her first years had been happy ones in a small but pleasant home where she was loved and valued and taught by a father who delighted in her quick mind and a mother who delighted in her warm heart, that she was a person of worth. Her father had not been rich, but he had been comfortable, and he had meant to provide for her. And had he lived, Esther would have grown up an ordinary gentleman's daughter, with an ordinary modest portion and an ordinary fair chance at the ordinary happiness of a home of her own. But he had not lived. He had died when Esther was 17, suddenly, of a fever, and her mother, never strong, had followed him within the year, of grief as much as anything, and the comfortable provision had proved, when the lawyers had done, to be very much smaller than anyone supposed, eaten by debts and a failed investment, so that Esther at 18 found herself an orphan and very nearly a pauper, with no home, no fortune, and no nearer relation in the world than her late father's sister-in-law, Mrs. Crowe, who had grudgingly agreed to take her in. And from the day she crossed Mrs. Crowe's threshold, a dependent and a charge, Esther's worth had been, in the world's eyes and her aunt's, steadily redefined downward, until the loved and valued daughter of a happy home became the despised drudge of an unhappy one. For Mrs. Crowe had taken her in, not from love, there was no love in Mrs. Crowe to spare, but from a calculation that a young, healthy, dependent niece, bound by gratitude and having nowhere else to go, would make a most economical servant, one who could be worked without wages, scolded without redress, and kept without the trouble of pleasing, since she could not leave. And so Esther had been set to work, and worked hard. The whole running of the household gradually shifted onto her capable shoulders, while the credit and the comfort went to her aunt and her cousin. And she had been taught, by daily repetition, to think of herself as the world now thought of her, a burden, a charity, a plain, portionless creature whom no one would ever want, fortunate to be kept at all. that she had not, in fact, come to think so, that beneath the scorn and the drudgery she had kept, folded and hidden but entire, the knowledge of her own worth that her father and mother had given her in those first happy years, was the quiet miracle of her character, and the thing that would, in the end, save her. For a woman who knows her own worth, however the world denies it, is never quite as defenseless as she seems. The first 17 years of Esther's life, the happy years, before the world taught her to think herself nothing, deserve their telling, for they were the soil her unbreakable worth grew in, and the reason her aunt's 7 years of grinding could bend her, but never break her. She had been born into a small, warm, unfashionable happiness in a modest house in a quiet county, the only child of parents who loved each other and adored her. And though there had never been much money, there had been everything else that signifies, and she had grown up rich in the only riches that last. Her father, Mr. Vale, was a gentleman of small fortune and large heart, a reading man, a kind man, who had wanted a houseful of children and got only one and poured the whole of his thwarted abundance of fatherhood into her. He had taught her himself, sitting with her over his books of an evening, delighting in her quickness, telling her she had a better head than half the men at his old college, and he had given her, without ever lecturing it, the thing that was to be her whole salvation, the settled inward certainty that she was a person of worth, loved and valued and capable, who need never measure herself by anyone else's yardstick. Her mother, a gentle, delicate woman, had given her the other half of it, tenderness and the example of a quiet goodness, and the habit of kindness to those below her, so that the little girl, who would one day comfort a weeping kitchen maid in a dark garden, had learned the trick of it at her mother's knee. It had not been a grand childhood, nor a wealthy one, but it had been a whole one and a happy one, and it had done its work before the world got its hands on her. By the time she was 17, Esther Vale was already, in every essential, the woman she would be at 25, clear-minded, warm-hearted, quietly strong, sure of her own worth in the unanxious way of the truly loved. And then, within a single terrible year, it was all swept away, the father dead of a fever, the mother following of grief, the modest fortune revealed as a heap of debts, the happy whole life gone as though it had never been, and a stunned orphan of 18 handed over to the cold charity of Mrs. Crowe. The world she fell into would spend 7 years telling her she was nothing, but it had got her too late to make her believe it, for the first 17 years had built something the next 7 could not pull down. Battered, scorned, ground to a drudge, Esther kept always, in the deep place her father had furnished, the knowledge of what she was worth. She carried her childhood like a banked fire through all the cold years, and it was that fire, never quite out, that let her bear her aunt's contempt without being destroyed by it, and that the Duke of Glanville glimpsed one night, flaring up for an instant in a pair of downcast gray eyes, and could not afterward forget. The texture of Esther's daily life under Mrs. Crowe's roof is worth setting down plainly, not to dwell on her suffering, which she would not have wished dwelt on, but because the patient dignity with which she bore it is the truest portrait of her, and because it is in the small grinding particulars and not the grand cruelties that such a life is really lived. She rose first in the house and went to bed last. She did the work of 3 servants and was paid as none. She kept the household accounts and managed the few real servants, and did herself whatever was thought too good for them to waste their wages on. She was her aunt's lady's maid, dressing her hair and mending her gowns and bearing her megrims. She was her cousin's unpaid dresser and errand girl. She nursed the household through its illnesses, sat up with it through its bad nights, and was thanked for none of it. She was given the cast-off gowns and the cold end of the table and the draftiest room. She was sent on every disagreeable errand and blamed for every mishap. And through it all she was reminded, by 100 daily words and looks, that she was a charity and a burden, that she owed her very bread to her aunt's grudging bounty, and that she had no right to complain, to want, or to hope. It was not the cruelty of blows. Mrs. Crowe was far too respectable for blows. It was the slow, ceaseless, wearing cruelty of being treated, every hour of every day for 7 years, as a thing of no value, which is a harder thing to bear, in its way, than violence. For violence at least grants that you matter enough to strike, while contempt denies that you matter at all. And the wonder of Esther, the thing that those who came to know her marveled at, was that she bore it without either breaking or souring. She did not become the cringing creature that such treatment often makes, all anxious eagerness to please. Nor did she become bitter and hard, repaying contempt with hidden hatred. She simply endured it with a steady, quiet dignity that neither begged nor resented, doing her work well because it was hers to do, keeping her own counsel and preserving inviolate behind the meek exterior the household saw, the private certainty of her own worth that no amount of contempt could touch. She was kind, still, in a house where no one was kind to her. She was honest in a house built on small dishonesties. She found her secret joys where she could, in a borrowed book read late by a guttering candle, in the company of the underservants who loved her, in the small daily exercise of a goodness that asked no audience. She had made, out of a life that would have crushed or corrupted a weaker soul, something quietly unbroken, and she had done it, she would have said, by simply remembering every day who she had been before, and refusing, quietly, stubbornly, invisibly, to let anyone persuade her she was less. It was not a dramatic heroism. It was the long, undramatic heroism of keeping one's soul intact through years of small attrition. And it was, when the Duke of Glanville finally saw it, the most impressive thing he had ever seen. Mrs. Crowe deserves a fuller drawing, for she was the architect of Esther's misery, and the kind of cruelty she practiced is the more dangerous for being so respectable. She never struck a blow, nor spoke a word the world would have called wicked, and she ground a young woman down for 7 years as thoroughly as any tyrant. She was a widow of comfortable means, hard, vain, and grasping, with a great opinion of her own consequence and a small mean soul, and she had 2 governing passions, which were the saving of money and the advancement of her daughter, and she had found in her orphaned niece a most convenient instrument of the first, and as she supposed, no obstacle to the second. The saving of money Esther served by being an unpaid servant for Mrs. Crowe, who begrudged every shilling, had calculated to a nicety the economy of a dependent niece who did the work of a housekeeper, a lady's maid, and a companion all at once, and cost nothing but her keep, and could be neither given notice to nor obliged to be pleased, and she had no intention whatever of giving up so profitable an arrangement, which was the true and selfish root of her endless insistence that no one would ever have Esther. For an Esther married was an Esther lost, a free servant gone, and Mrs. Crowe meant to keep her drudge to the end, and bent her whole influence to convincing both Esther and the world that the girl was unmarriageable, so that no awkward suitor should ever come to rob her of her bargain. The cruelty was not, at bottom, even personal. It was economy. She would have worn out and cast aside any dependent the same way. Esther was merely the one fate had delivered into her hands. The advancement of her daughter was the second passion, and there Esther served, in Mrs. Crowe's design, as a useful foil. For Mrs. Crowe had a daughter, Letitia, a pretty, vain, shallow girl of 20, whom her mother believed a beauty and a paragon, and meant to marry as high as money and management could reach. And it suited Mrs. Crowe very well to have always at hand a plain, shabby drudge of a cousin against whom Letitia's dressed and petted prettiness might shine the brighter, and onto whom all the household's drudgery might be loaded, so that Letitia's white hands need never be soiled. So Esther was kept plain and shabby and worked while Letitia was dressed and idle and displayed. And the contrast, carefully maintained, served the double purpose of flattering Letitia and demeaning Esther, and of confirming the county in its settled view that the Crowe household contained one marriageable young lady and one unmarriageable drudge. It was a comfortable arrangement for everyone in it but Esther, and it had run smoothly for 7 years, and would have run smoothly to the end, had the Duke of Glanville not come into the county, and had Mrs. Crowe not made the one mistake of her calculating life, which was to invite the despised drudge to be present as an extra pair of useful hands on the very evenings she was parading Letitia before the Duke. The cousin, Letitia Crowe, was so much the creature of her upbringing that it is hardly fair to judge her as one judges a grown soul. But she was, all the same, the petted opposite of everything Esther was, and the contrast between the two young women in that house is worth a moment's notice, for it lay at the very heart of what the Duke of Glanville eventually saw and chose. Letitia had been raised from the cradle to be everything Esther was forbidden to be: indulged, displayed, flattered, and idle. Her mother, who saw in her daughter the family's one ticket to grandeur, had spared no expense and no praise upon her. Gowns, masters, lessons in the accomplishments that catch a husband, a steady diet of assurance that she was a beauty and a treasure destined for a great match. And Letitia had grown up exactly as such a rearing makes a girl of no particular strength of character. Vain, shallow, selfish, and serenely certain of her own superiority to the drudge cousin who waited on her. She was pretty in the conventional way, a pink and white prettiness, much admired in a county not oversupplied with beauties, and she had the surface accomplishments, could play a little and sing a little and turn herself out to advantage. And on the strength of these, and her mother's relentless management, she had been launched at the Duke of Glanville with every confidence of success. She was not wicked, Letitia. She was merely empty, a pretty vessel with nothing much inside, all surface and no depth, the very type of the performing world the Duke was so weary of. And she had been so thoroughly assured of her own value, and had so thoroughly absorbed the household's view of Esther as nothing, that it never once crossed her mind that the despised cousin might be the more attractive woman, or that a duke might prefer substance to surface. And so Letitia made, all unknowing, the perfect foil for the very thing she was meant to outshine. For the Duke, sitting through the Crowe's evenings, had Letitia's prettiness and accomplishment displayed before him for hours, and found it precisely the empty performance he was so tired of. The practiced playing, the rehearsed sallies, the angling beneath the dimples, the whole familiar exhibition of a girl performing eligibility at a duke. While in the background, ignored, stood the cousin, performing nothing, asking nothing, simply being, with a depth and a quiet and a reality that the contrast only sharpened. Letitia's surface threw Esther's substance into relief. The more the Duke saw of the prized cousin, the more remarkable the despised one became by comparison, and Mrs. Crowe, in parading her daughter and using her niece as a drudge to set the daughter off, had, with exquisite irony, arranged the precise conditions under which a discerning man would be drawn from the one to the other. She had meant Esther to be the dark plain background against which Letitia's brightness showed. And instead, Esther proved the gold, and Letitia the gilt, and the difference between them grew plainer with every evening to the one man whose opinion would matter, until he could no more have chosen Letitia over Esther than chosen paste over a true jewel. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp low, the dark drawn close, the day's labors set gently down, then settle in, and let me tell you how a despised girl, whom the whole world had agreed no one would ever want, came to be seen at last by the one pair of eyes that troubled to look, and how the seeing changed everything. For this is a story about worth that goes unseen, and about the difference between the value the world assigns a person and the value that is truly there, and about a man who had nearly lost the power to tell the one from the other, and was taught to see again by the very person his world had taught him to overlook. I shall tell you, before the end, where in the world I picture you sitting. But first you must meet the Duke and understand what was wrong with him. For he was not a bad man, but he was a half-blind one, and his blindness was of the particular kind that wealth and rank breed, and that only something real can cure. The Duke of Glanville was 34 and possessed of everything the world esteems, and very little that it does not. And he was, without quite knowing it, bored to the very marrow of his soul. He had been born to greatness, and had never had to earn or strive for anything, and had spent his whole life surrounded by people performing for him, flattering him, courting him, arranging themselves to please him, showing him always their best and falsest face, because he was a duke, and a duke is never shown the truth. And the long diet of performance had done to him what it does to many of the very great. It had dulled his palate for the real, and bred in him a deep, unspoken weariness, a sense that everything was surface and nothing underneath, that all the bright, agreeable people who surrounded him were so many painted screens with nothing real behind them. And it had made him, without his ever deciding to be, lazy of perception, accustomed to take people at the world's valuation and his own first glance, because he had never met anyone who repaid a closer look, the whole performing world having trained him to expect none. He had come into the county to look over an estate that had fallen to him, and had been instantly besieged, as he was always besieged, by every family with a daughter and an ambition, and he had submitted to it with the weary courtesy of long habit, attending the dinners and the parties, being paraded before the eligible young ladies, going through the practiced motions of a great matrimonial prize on display, and feeling, beneath the courtesy, the old gray boredom, the certainty that here as everywhere it was all surface, that the pretty girls smiling at him saw a duke and not a man, and that there was nothing to choose among them and nothing real to find. Mrs. Crowe and her daughter were merely one family among many in this siege, and Letitia merely one pretty performing girl among many. The Duke attended their evenings as he attended a dozen others, and was bored at them as he was bored everywhere, and would have gone away at the season's end remembering nothing of the Crowe household at all, except that, at the edge of those evenings, half hidden in the background, fetching and carrying and being ignored, there was a quiet, shabby young woman whom no one introduced and no one noticed. And the Duke of Glanville, in the depths of his boredom, had, almost idly, begun to notice her. The particular malady of the Duke of Glanville's soul, the weary half-blindness that Esther was to cure, is worth understanding. For it is a common affliction of the very fortunate, and it had brought him, at 34, to a strange and joyless place. He had everything. That was, in a sense, the whole trouble. Born to a great title and a great fortune, he had never in his life wanted for anything, never had to strive, never had to earn the regard of a single soul, for the regard had always come unbidden, lavished upon his rank before he had done anything to deserve it as a man. And the unceasing lavishment had, over the years, worked upon him a subtle ruin. He had been flattered from the cradle courted from his boyhood, surrounded always by people arranging themselves to please him. He had never, that he could remember, been told an unwelcome truth, or met an honest difference of opinion, or been valued for anything but what he had been born to. And the effect of a lifetime of this was that he had come to see the whole human world as a kind of vast, flattering performance staged for his benefit, behind which he suspected there was nothing real at all. He had grown, in consequence, profoundly bored. Bored with the flattery he could not believe, bored with the courtship he saw through, bored with a world that showed him only its painted face and never its true one. And the boredom had hardened by his 30s into a settled weariness of spirit, a gray conviction that everything was surface and nothing underneath, that he was doomed to move forever among performers and never once meet a real person, because his rank made reality impossible, frightening the truth out of everyone who came near him. And the cruelest part of the malady was that it had made him lazy of sight, and so complicit in his own starvation. For a man who expects everyone to be a painted screen stops looking behind the screens. He takes people at their performed value and his own first glance, because experience has taught him there is nothing further to find. And so, the Duke had fallen into the habit of accepting the world's labels as the truth. This one charming, that one dull, this one eligible, that one nobody, and never troubling to test them, because testing had never yet repaid the trouble. It was this lazy acceptance of the world's valuations that had nearly let him pass Esther by, for the world had labeled her no one. And in the ordinary way of things, the Duke would have read the label and looked no further, as he had looked no further at 1,000 other labeled people. That he did look further, this once, that his boredom, for once, drove him to the unusual exertion of really seeing a person his world had dismissed, was the small accident of temperament that saved him. For what he found, when he troubled to look behind one screen the world had told him was empty, was that it was not a screen at all, but a real and living soul, the first he had met in years. And the discovery, once made, could not be unmade, and it pulled the whole structure of his weary cynicism down about his ears. For if the world was wrong about this one labeled nobody, then the world might be wrong about everything, and there might be reality everywhere, hidden, waiting only to be looked for. He had been half blind, and Esther Vale, simply by being real where he had been told there was nothing, taught him to see. What had caught his idle attention at first was nothing more than the oddity of her, the puzzle of a person who did not fit. For the Duke, bored and observant in the way of the bored, had noticed at the Crowe's first evening that there was a young woman present who behaved entirely unlike everyone else in the room, who performed for no one, angled for no one, sought no notice, and avoided his eye, who moved through the gathering quietly attending to its comfort, refilling a cup here, retrieving a dropped fan there, soothing a fractious old guest with a quiet, competent grace that asked nothing in return, and who, when she thought herself unobserved, wore on her grave face not the practiced animation of the other young ladies, but a still, contained, private expression that the Duke, student of surfaces, found he could not read at all. She was the one person in the room who was not a painted screen, and a man starved for something real, though he scarcely knew that was his hunger, will find his eye drawn again and again to the one real thing in a room of performances. He had asked who she was, and been told, with a dismissive wave, that it was only Mrs. Crowe's niece, a poor relation, a drudge, no one, the very dismissal that the world reserved for Esther, and that the Duke had all his life accepted as sufficient. And ordinarily, he would have accepted it now and looked no further, for no one was a complete account in the grammar of his world. But he was very bored, and she was very puzzling, and some instinct beneath the boredom would not quite let it go. And so, over the several evenings that followed, the Duke of Glanville did a thing he had not done in years, which was to pay real attention to a person his world had labeled beneath notice. He watched her. He saw how the whole comfort of the Crowe household plainly rested on her unregarded labor, while the credit went to others. He saw how she was spoken to, the casual daily contempt she absorbed without complaint and without servility, neither cringing nor resentful, but simply, unbreakably dignified. He saw, once, when a spiteful word of her aunt's was crueler than common, a flash in her downcast gray eyes of something, not anger exactly, but a clear, steady self-possession, the look of someone who knew the word was false and did not need to argue it. That struck him more than all Letitia's dimpling had ever done, and he found himself, to his own faint surprise, thinking about Mrs. Crowe's despised niece when he was not in her company, and looking for her when he was, and being, for the first time in longer than he could remember, curious about another human being. It was a small accident that gave him his first real sight of her, the kind of small accident on which whole lives sometimes turn. And after it, the Duke of Glanville was never again able to think of Esther Vale as no one. It happened at an evening party at the Crowes, where the Duke, escaping for a moment the determined gaiety of Letitia and her mother, had stepped out alone onto a terrace for air, and found, in the dim garden beyond, the niece, sent out, he gathered, to retrieve some trifle her aunt had mislaid, glad of a moment's escape from the hot, bright room. She had not seen him in the shadow, and he, half meaning to withdraw, had instead stayed still and watched, and so witnessed a small thing that told him more than a season of drawing rooms. For there was a child crying in the garden, a servant's child, a little kitchen maid of 9 or 10, who had been scolded and sent out, and was weeping in the dark. And Esther, who might so easily have passed her by, had stopped and knelt down in her good gown on the damp path, and gathered the grubby weeping child against her, and comforted her, not with grand condescension, but with the simple practiced tenderness of someone who knew exactly what it was to be small, and scolded and friendless, talking low, drying the small face, making some little joke until the sobs turned to a watery laugh, and then had sent the child off comforted and slipped back toward her errand, never knowing she had been seen. And the Duke of Glanville, standing in the dark, had felt something turn over in his chest that had not turned in years, for he had just seen, unperformed and unobserved, the thing he had given up believing in, a person being genuinely, unself-consciously good, with nothing whatever to gain by it, to a creature even lower than herself, and he understood, with the force of a blow, that the despised drudge his world called no one was worth more, in the only coin that finally counts, than the whole glittering company she waited upon. He had spoken to her then, stepped out of the shadow, startling her, and made some quiet remark to put her at ease, and they had fallen, there in the dim garden, into the first real conversation the Duke of Glanville had had with anyone in longer than he could say. For Esther, once she had got over her alarm at being addressed by a duke, had answered him simply and honestly as she answered everyone, with none of the angling or the awe he was used to. She did not flatter him, did not perform, did not even seem particularly impressed by his rank, treating him with a grave, courteous directness as one person to another that was so unlike everything in his experience that it fell upon him like cool water. And when he said something idle and clever of the kind that usually drew admiring laughter, she had not laughed admiringly, but had answered it with a quiet wit of her own that was sharper and truer than his, and had then, catching herself, looked half alarmed at her own boldness, as though a drudge had no business being clever to a duke. But the Duke had laughed, really laughed, surprised into it, and pressed her to go on. And Esther, cautiously, had gone on. And the two of them had stood talking in the dark garden far longer than either intended, the bored Duke and the despised drudge, until the cold drove them in. And the Duke had gone home that night, a changed man, having discovered, in a dim garden, that there was one real person in the county after all, and that she was the one everyone had told him was no one. From Esther's own side, the slow beginning of the Duke's attention was a thing she noticed long before she let herself make anything of it, and her wary, disbelieving response to it is as much a part of the story as his awakening. For Esther was not blind. She missed very little, having learned in 7 hard years to read a room and the people in it for her own safety's sake, and she had been aware, at the Crowe's evenings, that the great bored Duke's eye had begun, now and then, to rest upon her. Upon her, the drudge in the corner, when it might have rested anywhere. She had told herself at first that she imagined it, or that he looked through her as everyone did, at some object beyond, for the notion that the Duke of Glanville should actually notice Esther Vale was so contrary to the whole settled order of her world as to be very nearly unthinkable, and she was far too sensible and far too well schooled in her own insignificance to entertain it. But the attention persisted and grew until she could no longer pretend not to feel it. And then she grew wary and a little afraid, for experience had taught her that a great man's notice of a dependent girl was far more often a danger than a compliment, and she braced herself with a sinking heart for the kind of attention she had learned to dread. And she was the more disarmed, in consequence, when the Duke's notice proved to be nothing of the kind, when, that night in the garden, he spoke to her with a grave, respectful courtesy, asked her real questions, and listened to her real answers, and treated her, in short, as a person, which was a thing so few people had done in 7 years that it nearly undid her composure altogether. And even then, even after the garden, Esther would not let herself hope. She was too wise and had been too thoroughly schooled by disappointment. She knew exactly what she was in the world's eyes and exactly how impossible was the thing her treacherous heart might have begun to want. And she set herself, sternly, against hoping, telling herself that the Duke's kindness was a passing whim, that great men were often careless and kind to inferiors without meaning anything by it, that to read more into it would be the act of a foolish girl reaching above her station, and that nothing in the world was so certain to bring her fresh pain as to let herself believe, even for an instant, that the Duke of Glanville might care for her. She enjoyed the stolen conversations. She could not help that. They were the brightest moments of her gray existence. But she walled her heart against expectation as she walked away from each one, reminding herself that she was a drudge that no one would have, that her aunt was right about that if about nothing else, and that the Duke would marry some great lady and forget the poor relation he had been idly kind to in a country garden. It was a sensible defense, and a necessary one, and it meant that when the Duke did waver and withdraw, the blow, though it cut deep, did not destroy her, for she had never allowed herself fully to count on him, having known all along, as she thought, that such happiness was not for such as her. But it meant, too, that something in her had begun to hope despite all her walls, for one cannot be brought back to life by being truly seen after years of invisibility and feel nothing. And the hope she would not admit was there all the same, walled up and aching, when his withdrawal seemed to confirm her aunt's old verdict after all. The stolen courtship of those weeks, The few snatched meetings by which the Duke and Esther came to know each other under Mrs. Crowe's watchful nose was made up of small things. But the small things were real, and one of them in particular deserves recording. For it was the hour in which each first fully knew the other's mind. It had come about through a book. The Duke, casting about for some pretext to prolong their acquaintance, had mentioned at one of the Crowe's evenings a volume he thought the niece might like, having gathered, from a stray remark, that she read, and had contrived, a day or two later, to have it conveyed to her. And Esther, who had not been given a new book to read in years, and devoured the borrowed and the old, had fallen upon it with delight, and read it twice, and had been unable to keep from saying so, when next a chance encounter on the road threw them together. And so they had talked of the book, and the talking of it had opened, all at once, the whole country of her mind, to him and his to her. For Esther, forgetting her weariness in the pleasure of at last having someone to discuss a book with, had spoken of it freely and acutely, with insights the Duke had not had himself, disagreeing with him where she saw cause, defending her view with a quick, clear reasoning that delighted and challenged him. And the Duke had found himself in the unheard-of position of being argued with, instructed, even bettered, by a country drudge on a point of literature, and of enjoying it more than any conversation he could remember. They had stood by the roadside far too long, heedless of who might pass, deep in the kind of talk that two well-matched minds fall into and cannot bear to break off. And they had each come away from it with the startled private knowledge that they had met, against all probability, their match, that here was a mind that fitted theirs, an understanding that answered, the rarest and most precious of all human findings, which most people search for their whole lives and never make. After that, the meetings, however few and stolen, were never again mere kindness on his side or mere wonder on hers. They were the meetings of two people who had recognized each other, and who sought, now, with a growing and carefully unspoken eagerness, every chance to be in one another's company. The Duke would ride, with transparent regularity, on the roads where Esther walked her aunt's errands, and the two would walk a little way together, talking. Books passed between them, each loaned with a marked passage the other was sure to remark. A few words snatched at the edge of an evening carried now, freight that an eavesdropper would never have guessed. It was the strangest courtship. The great Duke and the despised drudge, conducted in lanes and corners and the margins of borrowed books, never named, never declared, but growing all the while into the deepest attachment either had known. And it was real. That was the heart of it. Real as nothing in the Duke's gilded life had ever been. Two true selves meeting at last beneath all the world's labels and finding, in each other, the thing the world's labels had hidden. Whatever the Duke's pride would shortly do to endanger it, and whatever Esther's wariness would do to guard against it, the thing itself was already, by those weeks' end, an accomplished fact in both their hearts. They had found each other, and some findings, once made, cannot be unmade, however long the finders may struggle against them. After the garden, the Duke of Glanville set himself, quietly and with a care that surprised him, to know Esther Vale. And the more he knew her, the more thoroughly the careless, half-blind man he had been was undone. It was not easily done for Mrs. Crowe kept her drudge close, and would have been instantly alarmed to see the Duke's notice stray from Letitia to the niece. And so the Duke's courtship, for it became that, though neither of them named it for a long while, was conducted in stolen moments and quiet corners, a few words at the edge of an evening, a contrived encounter on the road where Esther walked on her aunt's errands, a book passed and discussed. But little as the moments were, they were real, and they accumulated, And through them the Duke came to know the whole quality of the woman the world had thrown away. He found her mind quick and deep and well furnished, for her father had educated her, and she had never stopped reading. He found her conversation, once she lost her fear of him, the truest pleasure he had known, free of all flattery and full of a clear, honest intelligence that met his own as an equal and bettered it as often as not. He found her good all the way through, with the unshowy bone-deep goodness he had glimpsed in the garden, a kindness that years of unkindness had refined rather than soured. And he found, beneath the imposed humility, a quiet, unbreakable dignity, a sense of her own worth that her aunt's 7 years of grinding had bent but never broken. She did not think herself the worthless creature the world called her, he discovered. However, she had learned to bear being called it. And he honored her for that secret, unbroken self-respect more than for anything. And so the Duke of Glanville fell in love, really, deeply, for the first time in his jaded life, with Mrs. Crowe's despised niece. And the falling was the salvation of him, for it cured at a stroke the weary half-blindness that had been killing his soul. He had thought everything surface and nothing real. And here was a person all real and no surface, the realest thing he had ever encountered, who had been standing unregarded at the edge of his world the whole time, invisible to him as to everyone because he had been too lazy and too spoiled to look. It humbled him profoundly. It made him see, with a clarity that reorganized his whole view of the world, how much true worth must lie everywhere unseen beneath the world's careless labels, overlooked by people like himself who took the labels for the truth. And it made him understand that he had nearly wasted his whole life among painted screens, dismissing as nothing the only kind of person worth knowing, simply because the world had told him to. He loved her, and he found, with a settled certainty that astonished him, to marry her. To take this despised, penniless drudge whom no one would have, and make her his Duchess, and spend his life undoing the world's long wrong to her. And the only thing that stood in his way, when he had got so far, was the last stubborn remnant of the very thing that had blinded him, his pride. For there was a battle still to be fought in the Duke of Glanville, between the man his love had made him and the proud great personage his whole life had made him. And for a few bad weeks, the proud personage very nearly won, and very nearly cost him everything. It was one thing, his pride urged, to love a portionless drudge in secret. It was quite another for the Duke of Glanville to marry her. "Consider," said the cold, proud voice that was the residue of all his training, "what the world would say. A duke of his consequence, who might have any heiress or any beauty in England, throwing himself away upon a penniless nobody, his bride a despised poor relation, a household drudge, a girl the whole county had agreed no one would have. It would be the scandal and the mockery of the season. They would say he had run mad, been entrapped, lost his judgment. His great name, his consequence, the whole edifice of his rank would be laughed at. He would have married, by every worldly measure, disastrously beneath himself." The voice was strong, for it was the voice of everything he had been bred to. And the Duke, who had found the courage to see Esther's worth, found it harder than he expected to summon the further courage to defy the whole world for it. And so, for a few weeks, he wavered, drew back, grew cautious, let the stolen meetings lapse, told himself he must think, must be prudent, must not act in haste. Behaved, in short, like a man trying to talk himself out of the best thing that had ever happened to him, because he was afraid of what people would say. The weeks of the Duke's wavering, when his pride made its last stand against his heart, deserve a closer look, for they were the crisis of his whole character, and the thing he had to overcome was not a small or a contemptible enemy, but the accumulated weight of his entire life. It is easy to call him simply a coward, and Esther, wounded, did call him so in her own heart, and there was truth in it. But it is fairer to say that he was a man at war with his own upbringing, and that the upbringing was very strong. For everything in the Duke of Glanville's life had taught him, from his earliest years, that his rank was the most important fact about him, that he carried the honor of a great name, that he owed it to his family and his order to marry suitably, that a duke who married beneath himself disgraced not only himself, but his whole line and the very institution of his rank. And these were not idle notions, but the deepest assumptions of his world, drilled into him so early and so thoroughly that they operated in him below the level of thought, as instincts rather than opinions. And so, when his heart settled upon Esther, these instincts rose up against the choice with all the force of a lifetime's conditioning. A clamor of inherited voices telling him that to marry a penniless, despised drudge was unthinkable. A betrayal of his name, a thing no Duke of Glanville could do. And the clamor was the louder because it was not really argument, but reflex, the recoil of a whole trained nature against a thing it had been built to find impossible. For some weeks the reflex won, and he drew back, and his drawing back was the more wretched because part of him knew the whole time that he was betraying the best thing in himself for the worst. He was not happy in his retreat. He was miserable, torn, ashamed. He avoided Esther because he could not face her, and despised himself for avoiding her, and could not yet find the strength to stop. He told himself he was being prudent, sensible, dutiful, and he knew, underneath, that he was being a coward, sacrificing a real love to an unreal fear of what people would say. It was, in its way, exactly the same failure that had blinded him for years. The habit of valuing the world's opinion over the truth of things, of taking the label over the reality, now making its last and most damaging stand on the most important question of his life. And he might, left to himself, have lost the battle and let his pride talk him out of Esther for good, and gone on to marry some suitable nobody and live out his life in the gray, comfortable death he had mistaken for safety. What saved him, what finally broke the reflex and freed the man beneath it, was not his own strength, for his own strength was failing. It was Esther herself, and the thing she did when the moment came, which was to refuse to let him have her on cowardly terms at all. Her dignity, when his pride had nearly conquered, did what his own wavering conscience could not. It held up a mirror in which he saw, with intolerable clarity, the contemptible figure his pride was making of him. And a man may sometimes be shamed out of a cowardice that he could not, alone, find the courage to abandon. And Esther felt the withdrawal and understood it exactly, and it wounded her more deeply than all her aunt's cruelty ever had. For she had not asked for the Duke's notice, had not angled for it, had not let herself hope for anything from it. But he had given it, freely and warmly, until she had, cautiously, against all her hard-learned wariness, allowed herself to believe that one person in the world saw her and valued her and might even, impossibly, love her. And now he was withdrawing, going cool and distant and careful, and she could read the reason as plainly as if he had spoken it, that the Duke of Glanville had remembered who he was and what she was, and thought better of stooping to a drudge. It was, in a way, the cruelest blow of her life, far crueler than her aunt's open scorn, for her aunt had never raised her hopes, while the Duke had raised them high, and then, it seemed, dropped them, confirming in the bitterest possible way the world's verdict that she was, after all, not worth the having. And the old voice of 7 years, her aunt's voice, no one would have her, seemed about to be proved true by the very man who had almost disproved it. But Esther Vale was made of sterner stuff than either her aunt or the Duke yet knew, and she did not weep, nor pine, nor beg. She gathered her wounded dignity about her like a cloak, and resolved that if the Duke of Glanville had been ashamed to want her, she would at least never give him the satisfaction of seeing her ashamed to lose him. And into the middle of this, the Duke wavering, Esther wounded and proud, there arrived, like a thunderclap, Esther's great-aunt, Lady Penrose. Lady Penrose was Esther's great-aunt, her late father's aunt, a fierce and formidable old woman of 74, very rich and very independent and very much accustomed to having her own way. And she had been, for many years, abroad, settled long in Italy for her health and her pleasure, out of the country and largely out of touch, which is the only reason she had not long since descended upon Mrs. Crowe and carried Esther off, for she had loved Esther's father dearly and had no patience whatever with the grasping Crowe branch of the family, whom she had always despised. She had heard, vaguely and late, that her great-niece had been orphaned and taken in by Mrs. Crowe. She had supposed, comfortably, that the girl was decently cared for among relations. And it was only on her return to England that spring, and a chance remark from an old acquaintance about the shameful way the Crowe woman worked her poor niece, that brought Lady Penrose down upon the household like a frigate under full sail, to see for herself how matters stood. What she found enraged her. She found her great-niece, the daughter of the nephew she had loved, a girl of her own blood and her own brother's line, reduced to an unpaid drudge, worked and scorned and belittled, dressed in shabby cast-offs, and treated as a servant in the house of a woman not worth the polish on Esther's worn shoes. And she found Mrs. Crowe smug and unrepentant, plainly seeing nothing wrong in it, indeed, rather proud of the economy of the arrangement. Lady Penrose had a tongue like a lash and a will like iron, and she used both. She told Mrs. Crowe, in terms the household did not soon forget, exactly what she thought of a woman who would grind her own dead kinsman's orphaned child into a servant to save the price of a housemaid. She swept aside Mrs. Crowe's bluster and Mrs. Crowe's protests that the girl was treated with every kindness, and she announced flatly and finally that Esther was leaving that house within the hour and coming to her, Lady Penrose, to be established as what she was and always had been, a gentlewoman of good family and the great niece of Lady Penrose, and to be done forever with drudgery and dependence and the scorn of her inferiors. "You have had the use of her 7 years for nothing," the old lady told the gaping Mrs. Crowe, "which is 7 years more than you deserved. And you have called her, I am told, a girl no one would have, by way of keeping your free servant. We shall see about that, madam. We shall see what the world makes of Esther Vale when she is no longer dressed in rags and ground under your heel, but stands forth as my great niece, with my consequence behind her and my fortune at her back. I rather think the world may surprise you. I rather think it may surprise even Esther, who has been told she is nothing so long and so often by such a creature as you, that the poor child has half come to believe it. Get your bonnet, Esther. You are coming home with me, and you are never coming back." The scene of Esther's deliverance, the afternoon Lady Penrose descended on Mrs. Crowe and carried her great-niece off, was talked of in the county for a long while, for it was a most satisfying spectacle, and few who witnessed any part of it forgot the sight of the formidable old lady reducing the smug Mrs. Crowe to spluttering ruin in the space of a quarter of an hour. Lady Penrose had not announced herself. She had simply arrived, sweeping into Mrs. Crowe's drawing room unheralded, taken one comprehensive look at the scene, the comfortable aunt, the idle, dressed-up cousin, and her own great niece in a corner in a made-over gown, mending with the unmistakable look of a household drudge, and reached, in that one look, a verdict from which nothing afterward moved her. She had been coldly, devastatingly civil at first, drawing Mrs. Crowe out, letting her boast of her kindness to her poor niece, letting her explain how useful dear Esther made herself, how fortunate the girl was to have a home, how, of course, no one would ever marry her, so it was as well she had her aunt to depend on, letting her, in short, condemn herself out of her own mouth, sentence by complacent sentence, while Lady Penrose's face grew grimmer and grimmer. And then she had struck. She had told Mrs. Crowe precisely what she was, a grasping, mean-souled woman who had taken in a dead kinsman's orphaned child, not from charity but from greed, to have a servant she need not pay, and had ground that child for 7 years and called it kindness, and belittled her into the bargain to keep her too cowed to leave. She had demolished, point by point, every pretense Mrs. Crowe put up, and she had ended by announcing that Esther was leaving that house forever, that very hour, and that Mrs. Crowe might explain to the county however she liked the sudden removal of the niece she had worked so hard and so publicly to disparage. For Esther, the afternoon was overwhelming past words. To sit in her corner, braced as always for scorn, and hear instead a great, fierce old stranger, her own blood, her father's aunt, take her part with such total and crushing force. To be claimed, defended, lifted up, after 7 years of being told she was nothing. To be told to fetch her bonnet and come away to a home where she would be loved, it was so far beyond anything she had let herself hope that she could scarcely take it in, and went through the motions of her deliverance in a kind of daze, half fearing to wake. She had no possessions worth the gathering. She left almost everything, wanting nothing of that house. She said no farewells, for there was no one to say them to but the under-servants, to whom she spoke a few low, grateful words, and the little kitchen maid whom she kissed, and as Lady Penrose's carriage bore her away from Mrs. Crowe's door for the last time, Esther Vale looked back once at the house where she had spent 7 years being told she was worthless, and felt, rising through her days, not triumph and not bitterness, but an immense, trembling, scarcely believable relief, the relief of a soul that has borne a great weight in silence for a long time, and feels it, all at once, impossibly lifted. She did not yet know what her new life would hold. She did not dream, that afternoon, of dukes or deeds or duchesses' coronets. She knew only that she was free and loved and going home, and for that day, that was happiness enough, and more than she had had in 7 years. Esther's first weeks under Lady Penrose's roof, before any thought of dukes or weddings, were a quiet healing that deserves its own small notice, for they show what the 7 years had really cost her, and how it began to be repaid. She did not, at first, know how to be cared for. 7 years of drudgery and contempt had worn grooves in her so deep that she kept, for a while, falling into them out of habit, rising at dawn to be of use before anyone wanted her, reaching to clear away dishes that were not hers to clear, apologizing for taking up space, bracing at a raised voice, deferring and effacing herself as she had learned to do to survive. And Lady Penrose, watching these small, involuntary betrayals of what the girl had endured, was moved to a tenderness and a fresh fury by turns. The old lady set herself patiently for one so impatient, to teach her great niece to be a person again, to rest, to be waited on, to voice a preference, to take a kindness without flinching or apologizing, to occupy her own place in a household as of right, and not on sufferance. It was slow work, for the habits of fear and self-effacement are not unlearned in a day. But it answered, by degrees, as Esther came to believe, a little at a time, that she was truly safe, truly wanted, truly home, and that the cringing watchfulness of 7 years could at last be laid down. And the deepest part of the healing was the slow repair of her belief in herself, not her private knowledge of her own worth, which her father had set too deep for even 7 years to destroy, but the daily ease of it, the freedom to live as though her worth were real and acknowledged rather than guarding it in secret against a world that denied it. Lady Penrose's fierce daily love did this work. So, in its different way, did the Duke's regard when it came. But Esther did much of it herself, simply by being, at last, in a place where she was allowed to be whole. She bloomed, in those weeks, not into a different woman, for she was the same woman she had always been, but into the full, free expression of the woman she had always been, no longer folded small and hidden, but able at last to stand to her true height. And those who had known her only as Mrs. Crowe's cowed drudge, meeting her now, supposed they were meeting a transformed creature, when in truth they were meeting, for the first time, the creature who had been there all along, merely permitted at last to be herself. It was the same worth, unfolded, the same fire, no longer banked, the same Esther, simply come home to herself, and she carried into all her later grandeur the memory of those first healing weeks, and a lifelong tenderness for any soul she met who was still folded small and hidden under the long weight of being told they were nothing, in whom she recognized, always, her own former self. Lady Penrose deserves to be known beyond her thunderous entrance, for she was a remarkable old woman, and her sudden appearance in the story was not so much chance as the working out of an old love that had only seemed to sleep. She was 74 and had led a long, full, independent life of exactly the kind that the world of that day made very difficult for a woman, and that she had achieved by sheer force of character. Widowed young and left rich, she had declined to remarry, declined to be managed by anyone, and spent her decades pleasing herself, traveling, reading, knowing interesting people, settling for years at a time in whatever corner of Europe took her fancy, answering to no one and fearing nothing. She had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind and a heart that she kept well hidden beneath a formidable manner, but that was, for the few who earned a place in it, deep and fierce and loyal. And the deepest place in it had belonged to her nephew, Esther's father, the son of her favorite brother, whom she had loved like her own child, and whose early death, news of which had reached her late and abroad, had grieved her more than she let anyone see. She had meant, vaguely, to do something for his orphaned daughter. She had supposed the child safe among relations, and she had let the years and the distance and her own busy, independent life carry her along, telling herself there was time, until a chance word on her return to England woke her to the truth of how her beloved nephew's daughter had been used, and roused the fierce hidden heart to a wrath that boded very ill for Mrs. Crowe. For there were few things on earth that Lady Penrose hated more than cruelty, dressed up as respectability, and few she despised more than the grasping Crowe branch of the family, whom she had always seen through, and the discovery that her nephew's child, a girl of her own blood, the last of a line she loved, had been ground for 7 years into an unpaid drudge by a woman she considered beneath contempt, and belittled into believing herself worthless, lit in Lady Penrose a cold fury that nothing would satisfy but a complete and immediate rescue. She did not deliberate, She acted as she had acted all her decisive life. She descended upon Mrs. Crowe, routed her, and carried Esther off, all within a single afternoon, with the magnificent high-handedness of a woman accustomed to overriding lesser obstacles. And having got Esther home, she had set herself, with the same energy, to undo the 7 years' wrong, not merely to dress and establish her great niece, but to repair, so far as love and attention could, the deeper damage, the long undermining of the girl's belief in her own worth. "They have told you that you are nothing for 7 years, child?" she said to Esther, early, with unwanted gentleness beneath the fierceness. "And I find, to my sorrow, that you have half believed them, for one cannot hear a lie daily for 7 years and take no hurt from it. So I shall tell you the truth daily instead, until the lie is washed out, that you are your father's daughter, and my great niece, and a young woman of more real worth than the whole pack of Crows, and half the fine ladies in England. And you will oblige me by beginning to believe it, for I am old and impatient, and have not time to waste arguing with a goose about her own value." And Esther, who had borne contempt for 7 years with unbroken dignity, found that a little fierce love, after so long a drought, was very much harder to bear without weeping. And the two of them, the fierce old woman and the long despised girl, took to each other from the first with the deep instant recognition of two strong loyal souls, and were, to the end of Lady Penrose's long life, the dearest of companions. There is a hard truth at the center of this story that deserves to be looked at squarely, for Esther herself looked at it squarely, and her clear sight of it is part of what made her wise. And it is this, that the world's sudden discovery of Esther's worth, the instant Lady Penrose dressed her in silk, was not a tribute to her at all, but a confession of the world's own blindness. For nothing about Esther had changed. She was, in her Aunt Penrose's fine gowns, and under her Aunt Penrose's powerful protection, the identical woman she had been in her own worn rags under Mrs. Crowe's grinding heel. The same mind, the same heart, the same quiet dignity, the same worth, entire and unaltered. The county that now found her charming had had every chance to find her charming for 7 years, and had not troubled, because it had seen a drudge's dress and a poor relation's dependence, and had read those as the whole truth of her, never looking further. And the only thing that had changed, to make the invisible suddenly visible, was that she now wore the dress and bore the connection that gave the world permission to look. It was the same lesson the Duke had had to learn, writ large across a whole county, that the world sees what it expects to see, reads the label and not the substance, and will look straight through real worth for years if that worth is wrapped in a humble exterior, and then exclaim at the discovery of it the moment a rich relation rewraps the very same worth in silk. Esther saw all this perfectly, and it gave her sudden popularity a flavor she found more bitter than sweet. For there is something peculiarly galling in being fawned upon, for fine clothes and a great connection, by the very people who looked through you for years when you were the identical person in poor ones, and in knowing that their new regard is worth exactly nothing, being founded on the dress and not the woman. But she drew from it not bitterness. She was too large for bitterness, but wisdom, and a kind of armor, for having watched the world value her at nothing, and then, on no real evidence, at a great deal, she understood once and for all that the world's valuation of a person is not to be trusted in either direction, that it tells you everything about the world's eyes and nothing about the person's worth, and she resolved to hold her own sense of her value independent of it forever after, neither crushed by the world's scorn nor inflated by the world's flattery, but resting, as her father had taught her, on the quiet inward knowledge of what she truly was. It was this clear, hard-won wisdom that armed her for the scene with the Duke, that let her refuse him when he came to offer for the silk-clad great niece the love he had been ashamed to offer the rag-clad drudge, with such perfect dignity and such complete absence of either gratitude or grievance. For she had understood, before he came, exactly what his renewed suit meant and exactly what it was worth, and she required of him not the world's permission to love her, which she despised, but the courage to have loved her without it, which was the only thing that could prove his love real. She would not be the woman the world had given him leave to want. She would be loved as she was, beneath all dress and all connection, or she would not be loved at all. And she could hold to that against all the temptation of her own walled-up hopes, precisely because Lady Penrose's silk had taught her, by its very hollowness, how little the world's regard was worth, and how entirely her own true worth lay elsewhere, safe in herself, where the world's changing fashions could not reach it. The transformation that Lady Penrose wrought in Esther's circumstances over the following weeks was outward only, for Esther's worth, as we have said, had been entire all along, but the outward transformation was enough to open the world's eyes, which had never troubled to see past the rags, and it set the stage for the reckoning to come. Lady Penrose established her great niece in her own fine house, dressed her as befitted a gentlewoman of good family, and presented her to the world as exactly that, not a drudge, not a poor relation, but Miss Vale, the great niece and acknowledged favorite of the rich and formidable Lady Penrose. And the world, which had seen only a shabby servant while she was dressed as one, now saw, with the wonderful suddenness of people discovering what was always before them, that Mrs. Crowe's despised niece was in fact a young woman of grace, intelligence, and quiet beauty, with the unmistakable air of breeding that her aunt's rags had hidden. The very people who had dismissed her as no one now found her charming. The very county that had agreed no one would have her now wondered that so superior a young woman should have been so long overlooked. And Mrs. Crowe, watching her despised drudge blossom overnight into the admired Miss Vale under Lady Penrose's powerful wing, was visited by the first cold suspicion that she had made, somewhere, a serious miscalculation. It is an old truth, and a bitter one, that the world will see in a person exactly what it expects to see, and that the same worth which is invisible in rags becomes plain in silk, the worth being identical and only the world's willingness to perceive it changed. And Esther, who understood this perfectly, observed her own sudden popularity with a clear and slightly weary eye, knowing that she herself was not one particle altered, that she was the very same woman these people had looked through for years, and that all that had changed was the dress and the patroness and the world's consequent permission to notice her. But for all her clear-eyed knowledge that the world's new regard was hollow, founded on her aunt's consequence, and not on any truth about herself, there was one thing the change had given Esther that was not hollow at all, and that mattered more than all the rest. It had given her freedom. She was no longer a dependent drudge with nowhere to go, and no choice but to endure. She was a gentlewoman of good connection, secure under the protection of a great aunt, who loved her and would provide for her, free at last to hold up her head and live her own life and choose her own way. And that freedom changed everything about her situation with the Duke. For where before she had been a powerless drudge who could only be wounded by his withdrawal and could ask nothing and demand nothing, now she was a free woman with her own dignity and her own protector and her own choices, who need beg nothing of any man, Duke or no Duke. And when the Duke of Glanville, who had been wavering and wretched and ashamed of his own wavering, learned that the despised drudge had become the admired great-niece of Lady Penrose, and came, half in relief, to think that perhaps the obstacle of her station was removed, and he might have her after all, he found that he had reckoned without the one thing his pride had never taken into account, which was Esther's own. The Duke came to her at Lady Penrose's house, then came openly now, where before he had skulked in gardens, and found Esther changed in circumstance and unchanged in soul, and made, with more relief than grace, the offer he had been too proud to make a drudge, and felt free to make a great lady's great niece. And Esther, who had read his whole heart through all his wavering, heard him out, and then said the thing that was the truest measure of her, and that he never forgot. "I am glad you have come, your grace," she said, "for I have wanted to say something to you, and I had thought I should never have the chance. You wished to marry me, I think, some weeks ago, in the garden and the lanes, and then you remembered that you were the Duke of Glanville, and I was a drudge that no one would have, and you drew back, ashamed of having stooped so low. And now my aunt has dressed me in silk and lent me her consequence, and you find you are no longer ashamed, and have come to offer for me after all. No, do not protest. It is the plain truth, and I have had a great deal of plain truth in my life, and prefer it to the other kind. And I must tell you, your grace, that I will not have you on those terms, for I am precisely the same woman this evening in my aunt's silk that I was 3 months ago in my own rags. Not one particle of me is altered. The only thing that has changed is that the world has given you leave to want me, and you have taken the leave. But I do not want a man who needed the world's leave. I was good enough to love in the garden, or I was not. And if I was, then your drawing back when you remembered my rags told me exactly what your love was worth, which is that it could not survive the world's opinion. And if I was good enough only once I was dressed in silk and backed by a fortune, then it is the silk and the fortune you are offering for, and not me at all. I am only a poor relation grown grand by an old woman's whim, sir. Underneath, I am the drudge you were ashamed of. And I will not marry a man who can love the silk and was ashamed of the rags, for the rags and the silk cover the very same woman, and she is the same worth in both, and I will be loved for her or not at all. So I thank you, your grace, and I refuse you, not in anger, but because I have only one self to give, and I will not give it to a man who wanted it only after the world said he might. And the room was very still when she had finished, and Lady Penrose, who had been sitting by, pretending to her embroidery and missing not a word, set down her work and looked at her great niece with a fierce old pride that glittered suspiciously like tears. And the Duke of Glanville stood and took the whole just weight of it, white to the lips, and knew himself, at last and completely, for the half-blind, proud coward he had been. The weeks the Duke spent after Esther's refusal, the weeks in which he did at last the inward work that made him worthy of her, were the making of him as a man, and they were not comfortable weeks. He had gone away from that refusal with her words branded into him, and they would not let him rest. That he had loved her in rags and been ashamed of it, that his drawing back had shown his love could not survive the world's opinion, that he had come to offer for the silk and not the woman. He turned them over and over, and tried at first, as a proud man will, to find them unjust, to tell himself that he had not been ashamed, only prudent, that a duke's situation imposed considerations a private man need not weigh, that she was hard on him, unreasonable, failing to understand the real difficulties of his position, but he was too honest at bottom to sustain the self-defense, And as the weeks passed, and his first stung pride subsided, he came to see, with a slowly deepening shame, that she had been right in every particular, and that all his talk of prudence and position was exactly the cowardice she had named, dressed up in the respectable clothes that cowardice always wears. He had loved her in the garden. He had known it for the real thing. And he had drawn back because he had not the courage to value his own true sight above the world's empty opinion, because, after a lifetime of letting the world tell him what things were worth, he had let it tell him that loving Esther was beneath him, and had been too craven to back his own heart against the verdict. That was the whole of it, and it was not a flattering thing to see in oneself. And the Duke of Glanville, who had never in his easy life had to face a hard truth about his own character, faced this one, and was changed by the facing. For the facing burned something out of him. As he forced himself to look steadily at the contemptible figure his pride had made of him, a great man frightened out of the best thing in his life by the fear of being laughed at, he found his lifelong deference to the world's opinion beginning to seem not the natural order of things, but a kind of slavery and a degrading one, and he found rising in him, in its place, a determination to be free of it, to value things henceforth by his own true sight, and not the world's blind labels, whatever it cost him in the world's regard. He had watched the world call Esther nothing for years, and then call her charming the moment she put on silk. He had seen, in that, the exact worthlessness of the world's judgment, which he had spent his life serving. And he resolved, in those hard weeks, that he was done serving it, that he would marry Esther Vale if she would have him, for her own true worth, which he had been coward enough to be ashamed of, and let the whole world say what it pleased, and count its opinion at precisely the value he now knew it to hold, which was nothing at all. It was a real conversion, and a lasting one. The weeks of shame had done what no pleasure could, and made him, out of a half-blind worldling, a man who could see, and who had the courage to act on his sight. And when he went back to Esther at last, it was as that new man, humbled and clear and free, that he went. Which was why, this time, she could believe him. The Duke of Glanville did not argue, nor bluster, nor stand upon his rank. He took his refusal as a man takes a wound he knows he has earned, and went away silent. And Esther, watching him go, told herself she had done right, and believed it, and was none the less more wretched that night than her aunt's 7 years had ever made her. But the Duke had heard her all the way down, and he did not give up, for he had learned at last that the thing was worth fighting for, and that the fighting must begin with himself. He came back, not the next day, nor with another easy offer, but after some weeks, having done the hard inward work her refusal had set him, and he did not come to argue her out of her judgment, but to grant that it had been entirely just. "You were right in every word," he told her, "and I have spent these weeks learning how right. I did love you in the garden when you were in rags. That was the realest thing I have ever felt, and I knew it even then. And I drew back, not because I doubted you, but because I was a coward, because I had spent my whole life letting the world tell me what to value, and when my own heart valued something the world despised, I had not the courage to back my heart against the world, and I let the world's voice frighten me out of the best thing that ever came to me. You have read me exactly. The shame was not that I stooped. The shame was that I called loving you stooping and was frightened of the word. I am not frightened of it any longer. I do not care any more what the world will say, for I have learned what the world's judgment is worth, having watched it call you nothing for years and call you charming the instant you put on silk, and I would not trust such a judgment to value a horse. I want to marry you, Esther, not the silk, which I do not care a straw for. But you, the woman I loved in rags in the garden and have loved every day since, and was too great a coward to claim. And I have come to ask you not as a duke conferring a favor, but as a man who knows himself unworthy and asks anyway, because he cannot do otherwise. I will spend my life proving I have learned to see. But you must believe I loved the rags, for it is true, and it is the only thing that signifies. And Esther, who had refused him when his love came hedged with the world's leave, looked long into his face now that it came stripped of everything but the truth, and she saw that he meant it, all of it, that the change in him was real and deep and would last, that he had truly learned to back his own sight against the world's blindness. And she found that her own heart, which she had been so sternly governing, was entirely and helplessly his, and had been since the garden. But she did not say yes at once even now, for she had her dignity and her hard-won freedom, and she would make quite sure. She told him she believed him and would consider it, and would give him her answer when she had satisfied herself that it was no impulse of remorse, but a settled thing. And she let some weeks pass, and watched him, free now to watch without fear, secure in her aunt's protection, and needing nothing from him. And the Duke bore the waiting humbly, and proved himself daily, and pressed her not at all. And when she was sure, wholly, quietly, bone-deep sure, as her father had taught her to be sure of true things, Esther Vale chose the Duke of Glanville, freely, from the fullness of her own heart and the strength of her own restored dignity, a free woman choosing where she would, and gave him the yes she had been holding safe until it could be given clean. One more scene between Esther and the Duke deserves the telling, for it was the moment in which she finally let herself believe him, and it turned, fittingly, not on any grand declaration, but on a small and tender thing. It was after his true return, in the weeks when she was making sure, watching him with her clear, free eye, to satisfy herself that the change was real before she gave her answer. And they were walking, the two of them, in Lady Penrose's garden, talking as they had used to talk in the lanes, when the Duke fell silent and then said, hesitantly, that there was a thing he had long wanted to tell her and had not known how. He had been thinking, he said, of the first time he ever truly saw her, not in any drawing room, but in the dark garden at the Crowe's, when she had knelt in her good gown on the damp path to comfort a weeping kitchen maid, not knowing she was watched. He had never told her he had seen it. He told her now that it was that sight and no other that had undone him, that watching her be quietly, unself-consciously good to a small friendless child, with nothing in the world to gain by it, he had understood all at once that she was worth more than everyone else in that bright house put together, and had felt his whole weary cynicism crack, and that he had loved her, he thought, from that moment, though it had taken him long and shamefully to find the courage to act on it. I fell in love with you, he said, not because you were beautiful, though you are, nor clever, though you are that too, but because I saw you be kind when no one was looking. That is the truest thing I know about you, and it is the thing the whole world missed, and it is why I will spend my life trying to deserve you. I only wished you to know that I saw it. It has been my secret these many weeks, and I am tired of carrying it alone. And Esther, hearing this, learning that the Duke had loved her first, not for any of the things the world prizes, but for an unobserved act of plain kindness to a child, the very kind of thing the world never sees and never values, felt the last of her wariness dissolve, and knew, with the bone-deep certainty her father had taught her to trust, that this man saw her truly, all the way down to the part of her that no one else had ever troubled to see. For a woman may be courted for her face, or her wit, or her fortune, or her connection, and never once be truly seen, but to be loved for a secret kindness done in the dark, witnessed by chance and treasured in silence, is to be seen at the very root, valued for the deepest and truest thing in one, the thing that is most wholly one's own. She had asked of him only that he love her as she was, beneath all dress and station, and here was proof that he had loved her from the first, at the one place where she was most entirely and inwardly herself. She did not give him her answer even then, for she had said she would take her time and she was a woman of her word. But she knew, walking back to the house beside him in the soft evening, that the answer was yes, and had been yes since the garden, and that she had found at last the rarest thing in the world, not a duke, though he was that, but a pair of eyes that saw her true. And so it was that the Duke of Glanville sat at his writing table with the deed of the marriage settlement before him, and wrote into it, in his own firm hand, the name of Esther Vale, the very name that, 3 miles off and not knowing it, Mrs. Crowe was at that hour declaring no one would ever take. He might have left the writing to his lawyers, as great men do, but he chose to write her name himself, with his own pen, slowly and with a kind of reverence, for it seemed to him the undoing, by his own hand, of the world's long wrong to her, that the name the world had scorned and scrubbed and called worthless should be set, by a duke, upon the deed that made her his Duchess, in his own honoring hand. And he thought, writing it, that he had never in his life done anything that gave him such deep and quiet joy as the writing of those 2 plain words. There is a particular significance in the Duke's choosing to write Esther's name on the deed himself, in his own hand, rather than leaving it to his lawyers as a great man might, and it is worth dwelling on, for he meant something by it, and Esther understood what he meant. A marriage settlement is, in the ordinary way, a dry legal instrument, drawn up by lawyers and signed by the parties, in which the bride's name appears as a matter of form among the clauses and considerations. No one expects the bridegroom to take up the pen and inscribe it himself, and a duke, least of all, having people to do such things for him. But the Duke of Glanville, when the settlement was drawn, had sent the lawyers away and taken up the pen himself, and written into the space left for it the name of his intended Duchess with his own hand. And he had done it slowly, deliberately, with something very like reverence, because of what that name had been, and what he was making it. For 7 years, the name of Esther Vale had been a byword for worthlessness in a county that scorned her, a name spoken with contempt, or not spoken at all, attached to a despised drudge whom no one would have. Her aunt had all but scrubbed the dignity off it, along with the dignity off its bearer. And now the Duke of Glanville was setting that same scorned name, in his own honoring hand, upon the deed that would make its bearer a duchess, one of the great ladies of England, and it seemed to him, as he formed the letters, that he was performing a kind of restoration, taking the name the world had degraded and lifting it, by his own act, to the height it had always deserved, undoing, with 2 words written by his own pen, the world's long wrong to the woman who bore them. He told Esther so, afterward, when she asked him, half teasing, half moved, why he had not let the lawyers do it, and his answer was the truest declaration of love he ever made her. "Because your name has been used badly," he said, "for 7 years in this county, by people not fit to speak it. It has been a thing of scorn, a byword dragged in the dust. And I wished, with my own hand, to lift it out of the dust and set it where it belongs. which is upon the deed that makes you what you have always been, a great lady. I did not want a clerk to write it. I wanted to write it myself, that the same hand which is to honor you all our lives might begin the honoring there, on the page, with your name. It is the only amends I can make for having been, myself, for a few wretched weeks, one of the people who treated that name as less than it was. I treasure your name, Esther. I would not have anyone write it but myself. And Esther, hearing that, understood that she had been not merely loved, but seen, that this man valued not only her person, but the very name the world had despised, valued it enough to honor it with his own hand. And she thought that of all the strange turns her life had taken, none was stranger or sweeter than this, that the name her aunt had cackled no one would ever take was being written, with reverence, by a duke who treasured it, upon the deed that made it one of the proudest names in England. When the news broke that the Duke of Glanville, who might have had any heiress in England, was to marry Mrs. Crowe's despised penniless niece, the drudge the county had agreed no one would have, it broke like a thunderclap, and nowhere louder than in Mrs. Crowe's drawing-room. The full reversal of it fell upon that household with a force that was almost comical, that the very girl Mrs. Crowe had worked and scorned and kept in rags to save the price of a housemaid, the girl she had paraded as a foil to set off her own Letitia, the girl she had cackled over as unmarriageable to keep her free servants safe, that this girl was to be a duchess, raised in a single stroke immeasurably above the aunt who had ground her and the cousin who had been preened to catch the very duke now claiming the drudge. Mrs. Crowe's mortification was complete and very public. She had lost her free servant, lost her daughter's grand prospect, and been made the laughing-stock of the county that had heard her cackle, "No one would have her," and now watched a duke have her, and she had, moreover, nothing whatever to complain of, for she had brought every particle of it on herself, having had the worth of Esther Vale under her roof for 7 years, and seen nothing in it but a way to save wages. As for Letitia, the preened and prized cousin who was to have caught the duke, she had the peculiar misery of watching the despised drudge carry off the prize her whole upbringing had been pointed at, and learned young the hard lesson that prettiness without substance is a poor weapon against worth. However, the world is fooled in the short run. The wedding of the Duke of Glanville and Esther Vale was the event of the county, and the whole neighborhood that had once agreed no one would have her crowded to see her married to a duke. And the chief satisfaction of the day, for those who loved her, was the quiet completeness of the reversal. It was not a vulgar triumph. Esther would not have allowed it to be, and Lady Penrose, for all her fierce delight, had too much true breeding to gloat. But the facts spoke for themselves, and needed no gloating, that the despised drudge, the portionless poor relation, the girl the county had written off, walked up the aisle on the proud arm of the formidable Lady Penrose to be made a duchess, while in a pew sat Mrs. Crowe, who had ground her for 7 years and cackled that no one would have her, obliged to watch, before the whole assembled county, the most complete refutation of her cruelty that the world could have devised. There was no need for anyone to say a word to Mrs. Crowe. The wedding said it all. Every soul present knew the story by now, and the contrast between the radiant bride and the mortified aunt was a sermon that preached itself. And the bride bore her elevation as she had borne her abasement, with the same unbroken dignity, neither cowed as she once was, nor triumphant now, simply herself, grave and gracious and quietly glad, exactly as much a lady at the altar in her wedding finery as she had been in her rags in the corner, which was the whole truth of her, that the day made plain to all. Lady Penrose wept, and pretended she had something in her eye. The Duke, waiting at the altar, watched his bride come to him with the look of a man who had been given far more than he deserved and knew it. And when the two were married, and the new Duchess of Glanville turned to face the county that had so long looked through her, she did so with a serene composure that silenced forever. In that moment, the question her aunt had cackled so often. No one would have her, Mrs. Crowe had said. A duke had had her, had sought her out, seen her worth when no one else troubled to, written her name with his own hand upon the deed, and married her before them all, for herself and nothing else. And the county that had agreed with the aunt for 7 years now agreed, with the short memory and easy turn of all such counties, that of course it had always seen Miss Vale was something out of the common, and that the Duke had shown excellent judgment, and that the whole thing was vastly romantic. Esther listened to the new chorus with the same clear, weary wisdom she had brought to the old one, knowing it worth no more than the contempt it had replaced, founded on her rank and not herself. But she did not let it trouble her, for she had stopped, long since, measuring herself by the county's changing weather, and rested now, as she had learned to rest, on the love of the few who had seen her true, her dead father, her fierce great aunt, and the once blind Duke who had learned to see, and on the quiet inward certainty of her own worth that no chorus, scorning or praising, had ever been able to touch. The aftermath, for Mrs. Crowe and her daughter, was not dramatic. There was no ruin, no downfall, no public disgrace of the kind that overtakes a forger or a villain, for the Crowes had committed no crime, only a long meanness. But it was, in its quiet way, a thorough and a fitting comeuppance, and it took the form of giving them exactly the future they had earned. Mrs. Crowe lost, first, the free servant she had ground for 7 years, and discovered, the moment Esther was gone, precisely how much that despised drudge had been worth to her household. For she was obliged now to hire and pay servants to do the work Esther had done for nothing, and to manage, with hireling help that came and went and had to be pleased, a household that had run smoothly only because one unpaid and unthanked pair of capable hands had been quietly holding it together. The economy she had been so proud of collapsed the day her economical niece walked out the door, and she felt the loss daily, in her purse and her comfort both, and could blame no one but herself, who had valued at nothing the thing she could least afford to lose. She lost, too, her standing in the county's gossip, for she had cackled her verdict on Esther so loudly and so long that her spectacular refutation became a standing joke, and she could not show her face without some sly reference to the niece no one would have who had married a duke. And a woman of Mrs. Crowe's vanity felt that steady, quiet ridicule as keenly as a sharper punishment. As for Letitia, the petted cousin who had been pointed her whole life at a great match and paraded before the very Duke who chose the drudge instead, she had the peculiar mortification of watching the despised Esther carry off the prize her entire upbringing had been designed to win, and of learning, while still young enough for the lesson to take, that her pink and white prettiness and her surface accomplishments, unbacked by any substance, were no match in the end for the real worth she had been taught to despise. It did her perhaps some good. Chastened, and no longer able to shine by contrast with a drudge who had become a duchess, she grew, by slow degrees, a little less empty than she had been, and made in time a respectable enough marriage to a respectable enough gentleman, and lived a respectable enough life, considerably smaller than the one her mother had dreamed for her. Neither Crowe was destroyed. Neither deserved destruction. They were simply left to the natural consequences of their own characters, which is the most exact justice there is, to be precisely as comfortable, and no more, as their own meanness and emptiness allowed, while the niece they had scorned rose to a happiness and a consequence immeasurably beyond them, by the simple possession of the worth they had been too small to see. And Esther, secure in that happiness, spared them no resentment and sought them no harm, having far better things to think of, and knowing that the quiet contrast between her life and theirs was punishment enough, and one she need lift not a finger to administer. But Esther took no revenge and sought none. It was not in her, and besides, she was far too happy to spare any feeling for the people who had wronged her. When she met her aunt, after, as she could not avoid doing, the county being small, she was perfectly civil, neither cold nor cringing, treating Mrs. Crowe with exactly the calm courtesy she would have shown any disagreeable acquaintance, and declining, with a quiet dignity that was its own complete reply, either to gloat over her triumph or to pretend the past had not happened. And Mrs. Crowe, who could have borne open triumph or open resentment, found that calm courtesy the most unanswerable rebuke of all, for there is nothing so completely confounding to a person who has wronged you as to be treated afterward with a serene good breeding that neither forgives nor accuses, but simply, unmistakably, rises above. Esther, even in time, and quite without being asked, saw quietly to it that the servants of the Crowe household, including the little kitchen maid she had once comforted in the garden, were not the worse off for any of it. For she had not forgotten what it was to be small and overlooked in that house, and her new consequence she meant to spend, as far as it would reach, on lifting others as she had been lifted, and not one farthing of it on paying anyone back. There were those, even in her hardest years, who had loved Esther Vale, and they were the underservants of Mrs. Crowe's household, the kitchen maids and the boot boy and the old cook, who saw from below what their betters were too high to notice, that the despised niece was the one truly kind soul in that unkind house. For Esther, ground though she was into something near their own condition, had never once taken out her own hard usage upon those beneath her, as the ill-treated so often do. She had been, on the contrary, the friend and the protector of the household's lowest, shielding the small kitchen maid from her aunt's sharpest scoldings, sitting up with the old cook when she was ill, teaching the boot boy his letters of an evening from her own scant store of candle ends, sharing what small comforts came her way with those who had even less. They had loved her for it, with the deep, undemonstrative loyalty of servants for the one person above stairs who treats them as human. And her going, when Lady Penrose carried her off, had been mourned below stairs as it was celebrated above. The underservants losing the only friend they had in that house, even as they rejoiced that she had escaped it. She had wept, herself, only at parting from them. The one grief in her deliverance had been leaving behind the small souls who had loved her and whom she could not, that day, take with her. But she did not forget them, and that is the point worth making. For when she came into her own greatness, the despised drudge turned Duchess remembered the friends of her drudgery, and saw quietly to them as her new power allowed. The little kitchen maid she had comforted in the dark garden, the very child whose unobserved comforting had first undone the Duke, was sought out, in time, and taken into the Duchess's own household, and raised and trained and given a future no kitchen maid in that county could have dreamed. The old cook was pensioned. The boot boy, grown, was set up in an honest trade. It was no more than Esther had always meant to do, the moment she had the means, to lift, as she had been lifted, the small, overlooked souls the world tramples and never sees, for she had been one of them and knew their worth from the inside, having had her own overlooked so long. And it pleased her, more than all the grandeur of her new life, that she who had once had nothing to give but a kind word in the dark could now give a future, and that the kindness done in secret, for its own sake, in her hardest days, came back to her so. The child she had comforted, unobserved, becoming the first of many she would lift, and the secret goodness that had won her a duke's love spreading outward, through her new power, into 100 small, redeemed lives. The worth the world had overlooked in her had, in the end, taught her exactly where to look for the worth the world overlooks in others, and that, she always thought, was the best thing her hard years had given her, and the truest use of all that her happy ones had brought. The marriage proved, in the years that followed, exactly as happy as its unlikely beginning promised, and the change it worked in the Duke of Glanville was as great, in its quieter way, as the change in Esther's fortunes. For the man who had been bored to the marrow, weary, half-blind, slowly dying of the gray conviction that all the world was surface, came fully alive in the company of the one wholly real person he had ever found. Esther gave him what all his rank and fortune never had: honest companionship, a mind that met and bettered his, a love that was for himself and not his dukedom, and above all, the daily example of a soul that valued true things and despised false ones, which steadily remade his own sight. He learned, from her, to look behind the world's labels everywhere, not only in her, to find the real worth that lay hidden under humble exteriors all about him, to value substance over surface, character over consequence, in 100 small daily judgments that slowly transformed him from the lazy worldling he had been into a man of real discernment and real kindness. He had married, the world said, far beneath him, and he used to answer, as more than one redeemed duke in these stories has answered, that on the contrary, he had married very far above himself and spent the rest of his life knowing it, for he was perfectly aware that of the two of them Esther was the finer soul, that she had brought more true worth to the marriage than all his dukedom could weigh against it, and that the great condescension, if anyone had condescended, had been hers in taking him. Lady Penrose lived to a magnificent old age, dividing her fierce affection between her great-niece and, in time, her great-niece's children, and taking entire and very loud credit for the whole happy outcome, on the grounds that she had rescued Esther and frightened the Duke into deserving her, though she generously allowed that Esther's own refusal had done some of the frightening, and Esther herself, the Duchess of Glanville, became in time one of the most respected great ladies in the county, not for her rank, which she held lightly, but for the quality the rank had finally let the world see: her unfailing kindness, her clear good sense, her particular tenderness toward the dependent and the overlooked, in whom she never failed to remember her own former self. She had been a drudge, and did not forget it. She had been told she was nothing, and remembered all her life how that felt, and made sure that no one within her reach was ever made to feel it. And she used her great consequence to the end of her days, exactly as she had said she would, to lift others as she had been lifted, and to see worth where the world overlooked it, having been overlooked herself so long that she had learned, as few of the great ever learn, precisely where to look. There is a lesson folded into this story that is worth drawing out plainly before we leave it, for it is the lesson Esther's whole life taught, and it is one the world is always forgetting and always needing to be told again. It is this: that a person's true worth and the world's estimate of it are two entirely different things, which may happen to coincide and very often do not, and that the gap between them is almost always a failure of the world's eyes and almost never a fact about the person. Esther Vale was worth exactly as much, every day of those 7 scorned years in her rags in Mrs. Crowe's corner, as she was on the day she stood up a duchess in her wedding finery. Her worth did not rise by 1 particle when the world's estimate of her rose. The worth had been there, whole and shining, the entire time, and the only thing that ever changed was whether anyone troubled to look. The world had called her nothing and been wrong. The world had then called her charming and been right by accident, for it changed its verdict not because it had at last seen her truly, but only because she had put on silk and a great connection, and a verdict that swings from scorn to praise on the strength of a change of dress, with the woman underneath unaltered, is a verdict that knows nothing of worth at all, and tells you everything about the looker and nothing about the looked at. And the comfort in the lesson, for there is comfort in it as well as warning, is that it cuts both ways, and that the world's power to misjudge us is also its powerlessness to touch the truth of us. If the world's scorn does not prove us worthless, then we need not be destroyed by it. And if the world's praise does not prove us worthy, then we need not be puffed up by it. And we are left free, as Esther learned to be free, to rest our sense of our own value, not on the world's shifting weather at all, but on the quiet inward truth of what we are, which the world can neither give nor take away. Esther had learned this from her father before the world ever scorned her, and it had carried her unbroken through the scorning, and she carried it, unchanged, through the later flattery, holding herself steady against both, knowing her worth her own. It is the surest foundation a soul can stand on. And the moral of her whole strange history, if a fireside tale may be allowed a moral, is simply that you would do well to learn it too. That whatever the world has decided you are worth, in scorn or in praise, the world is very likely wrong, for it reads labels and not souls, and that your true worth is your own, entire and unchanging, in rags or in silk, waiting, like Esther's, only for the 1 pair of eyes that troubles to see it, which may, if you are fortunate, turn out in the end to be a duke's, and may, if you are wiser than fortunate, turn out to be your own. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A hard old woman cackled to her parlour that no one would ever have her despised drudge of a niece, and never dreamed that a duke was at that very hour writing the girl's scorned name, in his own hand, upon the deed that would make her a duchess. And the worth that had stood unseen at the edge of every room, plain and portionless and overlooked, was seen at last by the 1 pair of eyes that troubled to look and honored and raised up and loved. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have watched a despised girl proved worth more than the whole grand world that looked through her, and a half-blind man taught to see true. And I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from. Remember, if ever the world has told you that you are nothing, that no one would have you, that your worth is small, the world is very often wrong and sees only what it troubles to look for, and your worth is your own, entire and unchanging, in rags or in silk, whether a single soul has yet troubled to see it or not. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.